Well, we're recording. So welcome guys to what I'm calling truth and tension, church politics and culture. I like the terminology of truth and tension where it's like we're going to be talking about truth, but there's a lot of tension in regards to it. It's kind of a terminology I learned within this last year. But yeah, talking about all this stuff, I'm glad that all three of us got to be on this, four of us got to be on this call. So three awesome friends of mine. You guys I've always loved and respected what you guys have brought to just my personal life, but also the fact that we're just like-minded believers that can have conversation and we can walk away at the end of the night not being angry or like wanting to jump at each other or whatever. So we'll be talking about some stuff. Let's go around and introduce you guys. First, I will just say I'll start with Austin because it's alphabetical. That way we don't play favorites. I've had the pleasure of knowing Austin for a little over a year. We got to meet in a small group and love Austin's zeal and passion for the Lord, but also for your age, Austin, I'd say you're pretty balanced in your thinking and like you're pretty far ahead of a lot of other people. So feel free to share whatever you feel that you want to share about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I just want to say I'm super excited because I do think one of the major issues that and I'll blame my generation. So I'm 23, and this is the issue I've run into with so many people of my generation is that they're unwilling to talk about hard topics. So I love that this is an incredible format that you've able to gather people to talk about issues that a lot of people won't talk about. So this is great. But yeah, so I got to meet Mark in small group. We instantly clicked. I think one of the beautiful things kind of about Mark particularly is that he's able to facilitate an environment that you're able to share safely. And I think that's really important. Yeah, so I'm 23. I'm part of I'm still pretty young, but I feel like a bit of a paradox in the fact that I'm fairly young, but I'm also very traditional. So I am not hyper traditional where I'm going to be just ultra ultra conservative and such, but I'm pretty traditional in my values and my beliefs, which I feel is, and I tend to steer a little bit away from the more hyper progressive nature. So, which I think is somewhat different of my generation. So that's kind of me. I don't know. That's what
And you're from Kalamazoo, Michigan, right?
yes. So I have to do it because I'm from Michigan. So I'm right there in the hand.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't know Michigan shaped like a hand. That's why it's the hand joke. Yeah. Okay. It's funny for people from Michigan. I'm not from Michigan, but yeah. So we'll go next to Mr. David Choate. I've known David for probably, gosh, I was thinking about it earlier. We've probably known each other for 5 or 6 years now, maybe. I'm
Something
trying
like
to,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's
David and I got to work together at a company. That's how we've met. It was a Christian company, which was fun, and we were troublemakers to some degree. We'd always get in trouble for collaborating on projects and doing stuff together. And I got to take him to a conference at Bethel, and he's still my friend. So,
yeah. Yeah, no, I think my favorite part of knowing you, Mark, is that we definitely come from different I don't know, different veins of spiritual development and spheres, if you want to say it like that. I got saved in a Calvary chapel, so much different than Bethel, but I always and I'd heard a lot of different things about Bethel, and I would say the majority of it wasn't great stuff. But you were the first person I ever met from there. And so I always went, well, I mean, this dude's a pretty good representation of Christ in my life. And so there was always kind of an interesting dynamic between us that I enjoyed. It's looking like I'll be the elder statesman here at 43 years old. So for whatever that's worth, I was a pastor for 10, 11 years. I did all sorts of stuff. I'm a graphic designer. Was my career prior to entering into the ministry. And then right now I lead a business that creates digital Sunday school lessons for kids. And yeah, I got married, have 3 kids, and a bulldog named Brutus. So there you go.
so good. So good. Yep. And Denver Broncos fan. So You gotta have
Yeah,
that.
these are tough times in the kingdom, my friend. But yes, unshaken in my love.
You're not a Falcons fan, bro, so
That's true.
yeah, give it a rest.
And then I'll not, definitely last but not least is Mr. Joshua Woodward. Him and I've known each other for probably over a year now. We got to work together. He tried to hire me at one point, and I turned him down, which was okay. It's definitely the Lord there. But but definitely have always loved being around you, Joshua. I think out of all of the people that I've met, I would say like you carry a certain confidence about who you are, and just you've always got a really awesome, like, I mean, it's cheesy saying it, but like a pep in your step, and you carry yourself differently than a lot of people that I've met, and also just carry such a heart for the Lord and the church. But also like in a lot of the stuff we're gonna be talking about tonight. So feel free to share what you want to share.
Dude, thank you. I feel a little inadequate to Austin, so I'm gonna grab my mic. So this is my mic. I just don't feel like I have enough to give. No, I'm Joshua Woodward, born in Colorado, moved to Georgia like 2 years later, spent some real formative years in like Alpharetta, right outside of Atlanta. I grew up a vineyard kid, so my roots are kind of in the like Bethel, same vibe, same movement. And then, kind of as I grew up, like we ended up moving to Southern California, and stayed at the vineyard. We were actually, the church I was at was one of the very first church plants that John Wimber from John Wimber's church. So very like in the vineyard movement. And as a teenager, kind of got put off by the whole vineyard concept and, some of the mentalities of that, and ended up going to like a decently conservative church, and kind of spent the rest of my teen years there, and kind of formed in that, and then decided that Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry was going to be the next move for me. And I wanted to be a marriage and family counselor at this point, and so I was like, oh man, they've got this Sozo program, and apparently it's like real good for inner healing, so I'm here for it. Came up and didn't know exactly how I felt with, like, I don't know, shaking on the floor, and so I was like, maybe I'll go. I don't know. So got up here and was afraid they were gonna have like witches brew or something, and ended up being pretty cool, and felt like this is where the Lord had me, and had some freaking radical encounters, and met my wife, and now I've got a kid and a dog and another baby on the way. So it's I made out pretty good and still love Jesus. So hey.
So good. So good. I like many of you guys, I grew up in the church sphere. I grew up actually as a pastor's kid in the Seventh-day Adventist church. And my dad got kicked out basically when I was 7, and had the choice of like whether he got kicked out of the church, because the church structure is really weird, where like the church can actually vote out the pastor, which is really strange. So he had a choice of whether he wanted to become like a traveling pastor or kind of start his own church. And at that point, he had already kind of like clashed with a lot of kind of the religious mindsets of the church. And so I grew up thinking Saturdays were the holy day. We, Saturday morning cartoons were a no-go because you couldn't watch any TV or anything like that. So I grew up rather conservative. And then as we kind of like got further and further away from the Seventh-day Adventist church, I kind of went on my own journey. And it wasn't until I was probably like 12 or 13 that I started like actually kind of finding out who God was for me, because it was super hard to like have my dad be the pastor at a church. And even there's multiple times where like it was my best friend and I, and we were the youth group. That was it. Like some mornings it'd be like, I don't even know if we have a leader coming to this. So it was cool. I remember reading the book Jesus Freaks by DC Talk, where it talks a lot about martyrs and stuff like that. And that really shaped my faith. And it was super crazy because my church, it's not that they were against healing, but they didn't teach healing. And I remember when I was 12, 13-ish, there's a lady at our church named Aunt Teresa. She was kind of everybody's aunt. And she was suffering from like MS, some other stuff, Crohn's disease, I think it was actually what it was. So she was suffering from Crohn's disease and had a walker and would always struggle. And sometimes she couldn't make it to church. And so one of my good friends and I, we just like, were like, hey, let's pray for her and anoint her after church one day. And we just did that. I mean, now I know it was the Holy Spirit's leading, but then I was just like, it was like a no-brainer to me. Like if somebody was sick, let's just pray for them. And it was super cool because like within a week I got to see her and she was running around with her walker and like just had a lot of life back into her, which was so crazy. And so that was my first like miracle that I witnessed. But then had my weird ways as I kind of jumped in more teenage years and messed around with all sorts of stuff. And wasn't until I was about 18 that I had a radical encounter with the Lord, and then found my way to Bethel Supernatural School of Ministry, moved away. Now I'm back. So it's been a wild journey for sure. And sometimes not everything at Bethel makes sense, and that's okay, but we're here. So well, let's talk about politics, gentlemen. I've got a couple baseline questions for you just to kind of get stuff going. I will preface to anybody who's watching this, aside from us, I don't deem anyone on this call as experts in the political sphere. I definitely not an expert. I don't really do a ton of like digging online. I'm not quite a conspiracy theorist like some people on this call, which is okay. I dabble a little bit in some conspiracies. But for me, I'll start off by saying like if you guys aren't okay with sharing, you don't have to, but I would say I would say I'm a Republican, and I've probably voted for, I think I've only technically voted for 2 presidents, even though I'm 30. I kind of like signed up to vote, register to vote, and I don't know that it actually ever took hold because it's outside of a grocery store in Oregon. So I don't know that I actually was registered to vote, but I definitely remember voting. So like, just to kind of like break the ice, I definitely voted for Trump both times. But it's not a Trump or Biden thing tonight. But I'd love to hear your guys' experience, what you'd like to share in regards to this.
Well, sure, I'll jump in. So I would say I was a Republican, and feel like that party kind of moved away from kind of some of the central points that where voting really matters to me. I think I voted in every election since Bush versus Gore in there, and pretty much, through have voted straight Republican. I was tempted this last time to go third party, and I was on the verge. What's that?
Were you going to vote for Kanye?
No. I was going to vote for Jorgensen. But, the interesting thing that brought me back is I saw my opinion of the media. It was so intensely one-sided in how it was covering things. I thought, well, if Trump gets through, it at least keeps that in check. Right? Like if he is a maniacal dictator, there will be a counterpoint in a media that seems to its goal is to crush him at every turn. So those two things will keep each other in check. Right. So that's kind of what went down. And then I love to dabble in conspiracy, probably too much. I get sucked down the trails. I find plenty of good things from Twitter hashtags and go down the rabbit trail. And yeah, and then we have like a rule in my house between my wife and I where I get to share one political fact or theory a day. Beyond that, I think I'm banned. So anyway, that's the state of affairs here.
That's so great.
That's fantastic.
I'll go. I'm a recovering Republican. No, I grew up in a very Republican house, and but one of the things that my parents, both instilled in me, and especially my dad, raised money for nonprofits and would always joke, Christian nonprofits would always joke that if any of his friends ever found out he listened to NPR, he would never get another dime. And so I grew up with a pretty healthy understanding of like, there is a middle ground. And so I think as I've gotten older, I've kind of been on this journey of trying to figure out where I land. And so, there's ideals and thought processes that I appreciate from both of our parties, but definitely feel like there's not one that I've landed with and not one that I like really align with as a whole. And so I've been an independent since I registered to vote. I've never voted for a president. I do really care about local and what's happening and what I feel like I can affect and how I can affect change. As a Californian, my faith in my vote is a little tainted, I guess. And growing up in California, it's even if you vote for a Republican, it's most likely not going to go that way. And so I think that kind of skewed my view from a really young age of my voting for a president. But again, like I voted for Jesus this time because I felt like he was a really good candidate.
So good. So good. What about you, Austin?
Yeah, so as far as presidents, I have not voted. This last time was like the first time I could vote in the first presidential election, and my absentee ballot, because I'm registered to vote in Michigan, but living in Redding, California, didn't get there in time, which was kind of a bummer. But as far as kind of what I would consider myself, I don't love the terms Republican, Democrat, because they shift so radically over time what that actually means and their party. I tend to go with ideology, and I tend to ascribe more to the conservative, traditional. Probably more libertarian would be the best way to describe it. I have kind of went through a stint where I was very progressive and because I just had lots of peers who were, and a lot of that made sense to me. But as I actually started to do independent research, I started to lean more on the side of high level of personal freedom and less as little government restriction or intervention as possible. So.
Yeah, I would say it's super challenging because like I grew up in a Christian household, and I would say my parents are probably Republican, but we never talked politics at all. Like I remember a lot of the presidential elections growing up. Like I remember the Bush versus Gore election, and I remember staying up super late when the whole recount was happening in Florida, and I remember a lot of that stuff. So I remember quite a bit of what was happening. Alexa's listening. It's kind of creepy. But I remember a lot of that. I had the privilege of getting to see, I've actually seen both Bushes in person as they traveled through Southern Oregon. I can resonate with you, and David can probably resonate with you, Joshua, because in Oregon, almost the entire state is Democratic, except for like Southern Oregon is like Republican and like Eastern Oregon. So when you look at like the voting maps, it's like Portland and Salem are Democratic. And that's just how the state goes. And so it's super frustrating when you look at it. It just feels like your vote doesn't matter. And that's why so many people are fighting for a state of Jefferson, because that's Southern Oregon and Northern California, which who knows if that will happen. So as we kind of like talk more about this, I'd be curious what you guys feel like is like our responsibility as Christians when it comes to politics and voting. This is such an interesting topic because I would say, I think we did like some stats recently and found out that like 36 million Christians didn't vote in the last election. So this would have been 2016. And when you think about how many, like that's a ton of people not voting. That's just specifically Christians not voting. But then when you look at local elections, most local elections are typically won by like 1,000 votes. So when you've got 36 million people sitting on the sidelines and call themselves Christians or identify as Christians, they're just not choosing to vote for whatever reason. So there's no right or wrong answer, but I'd be curious what you guys feel like your personal responsibility is, or what Christians' responsibilities are within voting in politics.
I talked to my wife about this last night because I was really challenged by the question. I think I don't know that I even align with the question itself, because I don't think that I don't think that my Christianity is the space that I vote from. I think my core convictions as a Christian, what influences me is my belief system, but also, my cultural context does, and who I am as a human being influences that. And so I think that there's things as a Christian that I care about that I want to vote on, but the question is super interesting to me, because it's what do you feel is our responsibility as Christians? And it's like, do we have a responsibility as Christians? That I think I kind of would like your perspective on that. Do we as Christians have a responsibility, or is it like an American responsibility?
Yeah, it's a weird one, man. And I agree with this, because if I get frustrated in an election, it always comes back around to like, why? Like, what were you hoping? What was your expectation that would come out of this? And my dad and I, he like found Rush Limbaugh, at some point in his life. And so I grew up going on road trips and listening to him. And so I have a perspective of Rush Limbaugh that's like, this guy's a hysterical entertainer. He's a very funny dude, but he made politics kind of accessible. So we were always talking politics. And him and I went on a walk recently, could have been about, I don't know, like 3-4 months ago. And we were talking about like the importance of, appointing a Supreme Court justice and what that would mean for the country. And my dad was like, I used to really think that was the most important thing. And the older I get, the more I've come to see that none of these institutions, the Constitution itself isn't divine. The Supreme Court, any of these things are fallible, and they're not created in such a way to withstand or to stand against sin and corruption and all of these things. Any of them can be worn down. And so it's an interesting question, because I can talk from that perspective. I can talk myself out of voting very easily and just be like, well, what's the point? The kingdom that I'm living for is not an earthly kingdom. But then, it's like, we're not supposed to live a monastic life where we hide away and isolate and not engage the culture around us, but then, I have times here where I'm like anxiety ridden, because it's like, okay, if they steal it all, and if this happens, then, so I don't know, it's a really weird spot for me right now. I find myself thinking a lot, going, what is the point? What is the responsibility in it, and how should a Christian feel about their vote, the importance of it, the importance of encouraging or advocating participation in a local government, or in the selection of a larger federal government. So I don't know. I don't really have solid answers. Maybe I'll kick it over to the young gun, Austin, and get his perspective on this.
Yeah, this question really challenged me. It's such a simple question, but one that when you actually open it up is just a whole maze of various things. And one of the things that kind of, when you were saying, David, that I was reminded of, I think it was Jocko Willink that said, one man is not powerful enough to destroy America. And I've been hearing Christians, ultimately, I'm in the Christian sphere, so I'm going to hear more of them, but I'm hearing lots of Christians in a near panic, thinking this is the election that's going to determine our fate. And in a lot of ways, I think some Christians, and maybe it's unintentional, but have placed their faith in their governmental body rather than in Jesus, ultimately, which is, I think, a poor place to. I personally think that politics is incredibly important in the believer's life. I mean, it's never explicitly stated, but the way that Jesus interacted with his leaders of the day was actually challenging a lot of political narratives and political systems that were happening. I mean, even with the Roman law of Jews having to carry a Roman's jacket, that was a pretty tough response Jesus gave to said carry an extra mile. So as far as the responsibility of Christians, I'm torn because there's one aspect of me that says we're called to influence culture, but there's another part that I look at the verse that says you're a city on a hill. There is an aspect of separation. There's an aspect of separation that I am not allowing the world to touch me because I am the one actually touching the world. So I think for the responsibility, I'm kind of like both of these guys. I don't have a strong answer. Those are just kind of my initial thoughts that I do think that I've heard lots of Christians, at least in my generation, kind of say we're kingdoms of heaven, not of this earth, and so with us we shouldn't be concerned about what goes on our government. And I'm like, that's actually not particularly wise, because you're shirking part of your responsibility, not just as a Christian but as a citizen. That's just kind of my
it's tough. I don't know that there is an answer to it. I do think that our pastor Bill Johnson, he was talking about the election, and he was saying like prayer without action doesn't do anything. Like he's like, definitely pray about who your leaders are, but you have to vote as well, because like prayer without action is like it's meaningless to some degree. Like God's looking for us to actually co-labor and actually like get in the voting process. And it feels really tricky to like just sit on the sidelines and go like, oh, I'm not going to vote, because a lot of the local elections are won by such a small margin. But what's difficult for me as a person in my entire life that I've been around for, I can't say that my life has changed by who's been president. Now, there's always been the fear, like you're saying, Austin, so many people are saying like, well, it depends on who's going to win this election, or who has won this election is going to determine how everything falls out. I remember when Bush was running against John Kerry, and I went to a pretty private Pentecostal, like traditional Pentecostal school, and they were saying, everybody was saying John Kerry's the Antichrist, and if he wins the presidency, like Revelation's going to be kicked into full gear, the rapture is going to happen. Like they put so much emphasis on this other person, and it's not, none of it's biblical based, but it's super, super challenging, because it's like, yeah, I don't know what our responsibility as Christians are. I do feel like if we're going to say something, or get like, if we're going to complain, if we're going to like get frustrated, like we have to get involved. I remember reading this book that was saying like, it's great if you have frustrations about the school system and what they're teaching your kids and all that stuff. Like it's good that you care about that, but at the end of the day, like, are you going to the parent teacher conferences? Are you like actually like trying to influence where you can? Are you trying to like bring about change rather than just complaining and sitting around and waiting for stuff to happen? So it's a challenging question, and I think many Christians would rather just abstain, because politics is too confusing, too much of a hot topic, so they just rather not get involved at all.
Yeah, and I mean this election, what makes it really unique, at least in my lifetime, is we don't have a concession, and we don't have a concession because Trump is going, there's blatant fraud. And so then that adds a whole other level of it, because part of the way that our system is set up is that the people are given rights and freedoms to influence, right? And so that can be, peaceful protest, assembly, all of these things. And so now we start getting into this weird space of, okay, you did vote. Now does the Christian have a responsibility to go and march to the Capitol, and to do whatever? And for me, like right now, I've hit this weird thing, and I'd love to hear from you guys in it. Like if I was observing two kids, and I saw one kid cheating the other kid out of something, I would feel a moral duty and responsibility to intervene and to go, you know what, you're taking advantage of this person, and you're preying on this person who's weaker than you, right? If that was the scenario. So I would get involved. If I saw someone who was stronger beating up someone who was weaker, who obviously couldn't defend themselves, I would feel a moral obligation to intervene and get involved. But as this thing grows, as it goes beyond just me and an individual, and it's like, well, do you get involved in someone else's family? Maybe if I know them well enough. Do you get involved in, your larger church, your town, it starts becoming more and more murky. And I kind of hit this spot of like, well, I don't know. I don't know if there is a moral obligation. Let's say you go 100% there was fraud. Is there a moral obligation for me to intervene the same if it was two people that I knew directly? So anyway, I'll throw that out there. I'd love to hear you guys' perspective because I kind of got stuck a little bit there in my own thinking.
That's tough. Before anybody else answers, so I want you guys to answer, but it reminds me of, and I think it's a Malcolm Gladwell book that talks about how like if you are alone on a street and you see somebody like attacking a woman and they're like, gonna rape her or whatever, and it's just you and you see it, that person is so inclined to call the cops and intervene and like do something. But as you add more people to that street, everybody else is waiting for somebody else to intervene. So like it's crazy that like 50 to 100 people or whatever the book says, I forget, but they say like they've done studies and stuff like that. And the more people that are present, they're willing to just let the crime happen, let this woman get, potentially raped or whatever, beaten up, because everybody's thinking that somebody else is going to step in and do the job for them. So
yeah, that's the bystander effect. It's scary.
So I'm curious what you guys think. I don't know if you want to answer, Joshua, because I know you've got stuff to say on this.
Dude, no, that's so good. I feel like it kind of messed with me a little bit when you put it in the terms of the bystander effect, because it does change things for me. Belichick cheating. It's like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, it's or there's levels to, there's something blatantly happening. And I think Mark and I were talking this afternoon about, can you be 100% sure about anything? Like, and for me, I feel like that's the deconstructing of my youth that I've gone through and am going and continually going through, is this life is black and white. And then going, wait, there's actually gray. And so I think that, but it does start to push towards the bystander effect, where it's like, I think my wife and I have both been in this place of like, dude, if voter fraud happened, I hope it's exposed. If it didn't, I hope everyone shuts up. Like, that's kind of it's, but I recognize, even as you're saying that, now that is the bystander effect. It's going, okay, what is my due diligence as a human being? What's my moral or ethical obligation as a human being? There goes my son's sleep. Hold on.
Your dog's like, preach, come on.
So good.
That's what you get for being in a tiny shed in your backyard. Anyway, oh man, yeah, no, that's definitely messing with my brain, because I think it's easy to ride waves on either side. If you're hearing stuff from the left, if you're hearing stuff from the right, it's like, it's so easy to be like, y'all are idiots, instead of going, no, let's take a step back. What is my moral obligation on either side? What does it look like to love my neighbor? What does it look like to serve somebody? It's man, that's challenging. I feel like I got to step back on that and think for a second, because that's good. That's a good point.
Yeah, one of the phrases that kind of comes to mind, and I feel like this might seem a little off base, but I'm going to tie it back in, is there's the old phrase, I think David Brower, I think I might said it, but he said, think globally, act locally. And I think what so many times us as Christians, and really I don't want to even blame Christians for this, I just think the world right now, we are so concerned with the global impact of things. And I think there's place for that. But I have struggled this within myself, that I have rejected my local responsibility in favor of trying to act on globally. So in terms of the voter fraud, what can I, as a 23-year-old person living in California who is a resident in Michigan, can do? I can vote, and that's really about it. And I think at that point, I guess my perspective would be, you work and you do as much as you can until you can't anymore, and then you have to just let back and let God. And because if we can, I think you can get in this cycle of wanting to then try to do everything and to change everything. I was actually just reading a book where they were actually talking about the subject of race, and I won't dive into that, but they were essentially stating, they were sharing a story of how they went to, they think, the UK, and were meeting with this Jamaican church, and all of a sudden this Jamaican, the congregation of this Jamaican church just started yelling at them, saying that why weren't you present, why didn't you help us? And they were essentially but one of the things that I thought was interesting about that was they were trying to take responsibility for something that they had no control over and ultimately could have no impact on. And I think we sometimes as Christians can try to do that, is where we try to overextend in a desire to have things be right. We will try to step outside of what our authority is. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I would say you bring up some good points, because I'd say like there's several people that I'm friends with and people that I follow on social media that it's like ever since November 3rd, it's like all they're talking about is exposing something. And it's like we're riding on the coattails of everything COVID, kind of, because some of these same people are the same people who've been like shouting from the rooftops that this COVID thing's a hoax, that, like this virus is fake and people just need to get over it and all that stuff. And so it's super challenging, because you're like, okay, there's definitely more to life than just posting on social media about like all of what you think is voter fraud, trying to find the newest article, the newest
There's
video.
much more to life than that, Mark.
There's so much more to life, and people are missing out on so much. And I feel like there's been I love the movie The Prestige. Love the movie The Prestige, and I got to watch it with Austin and a few other people. I forget when we watched it. It was maybe 2020. If not, it was late 2019. But I love the like opening phrase of the movie, where it's like, are you watching closely? And that like just opens up the whole movie, and it becomes the whole theme throughout the movie. It's like, are you watching closely? Because if you're not watching closely, you're going to miss what's happening. And I feel like all of 2020 specifically, that's been a reminder for me, is I'm like, okay, Lord, am I actually paying attention to what's really happening right now? Because all of this stuff that's happening, I think, is a larger distraction potentially for what really is the problem. And we know that Trump loves stirring stuff up to kind of like distract the media while he does other stuff. Like, he's brilliant for playing the game that way. But I feel like the enemy, not to compare Trump to Satan at all, but I feel like the enemy is stirring stuff up, especially with like a lot of these Christians, and trying to get them to focus on what's really happening when like families are falling apart and like depression is setting in. And there's so much like, there's more mental health issues now than I think there has been and ever, as everybody's just socially distant and, shelter in place and all this stuff. And like, so much is happening in our own backyard, but we're so distracted with what's happening on a global level, and so concerned about, did our person win? And
yeah, man. And I will say, there seems like there's a phenomenon that those who are yelling the loudest about some of these things, you're hard pressed to find much evidence in their personal relationships of them fighting for those same things. So if they're advocating for, integrity in government, they haven't ever stepped foot into any local government institution or tried to be an active participant in that process. If they're advocating for justice in this, there has been very little engagement with you don't have to look very far to find injustice in society. And so I would agree, if you aren't involved in those things personally, it kind of guts your platform to speak in a national or a broad-based perspective. I still think the question is, what is the broad-based? Let's say you're doing those things. Maybe the thought is it would be some form of like Esther, that it would lift you to a position where you could speak to authority and have influence. And until that has happened, focus on local, maybe.
Yep. I mean, I would agree with that a ton, because even in my own life, I've seen it, but I've seen it throughout the Bible. I've seen it throughout people's lives where it's like, I mean, I forget the cheesy Christianese phrase we use, but like God, it's God who promotes people. Like anybody who's like a self-proclaimed activist or self-proclaimed whatever, like those people don't actually like withstand anything. It's like God who promotes people. But what's super interesting is like to kind of bring it close to home. Like my dad has run for city council twice now. The first year he ran, I forget when it was probably 4 years ago. He ran for city council and something happened where like his name didn't get on the ballot. And in Oregon's super weird where you vote in wards, especially like in Medford, Oregon, where he's at. They split up the city council within wards of the town, which is super confusing because like nobody knows what that is and how do you know what ward you live in and stuff like that. So anyway, something happened with him the first time he ran for city council where his name didn't get on the ballot because nobody told him he had to do it and he was new to the whole thing. And so it was like the last minute thing. And so a lot of people had to do write-ins and all that stuff, which who's going to do that? And so he lost the first one and he was like fine with it. Then everybody kind of was encouraging him to run for city council again. So he ran this last election. So he ran in November for city council. He put yard signs up. He kind of did some social media stuff and he's super well known in the community. And what was super interesting is people started vandalizing his yard signs over everybody else's. So you'd go on his walk and stuff like that. And all of his yard signs would be in the trash or whatever. And he put new ones up and other people's were untouched. But then his name is Chad McComas, and he was running against somebody in the same ward named like Chad, like McKenzie or McCormick or something like that. Like no joke. And so he lost to that Chad. He lost to that one, and that other Chad got tons of votes. My dad barely got any, and he's kind of looking at it like, well, yeah, it's a bummer, but like God's gonna do what God's gonna do, and I'm gonna go where God's leading. And if I was supposed to be city council, I was supposed to be city council. I do think that this other Chad took a bunch of my votes because it was so similar in name. Like, and so he's just kind of like, yeah, whatever. Like, I'll move on. And I think it was the mayor of one of the towns close by was on the phone with him and it was like, you know, you actually do way more for the city in your position currently than you would do in city council. Like, why would you even bother getting involved in that city council stuff? Because he runs some major nonprofits and all this stuff and has great relationships with the police chief and the mayor and is traveling and doing a bunch of other stuff. And so it's pretty crazy to just like, I don't know, it just feels weird if and to kind of bring it to a different topic, but like, let's say voter fraud was 100%, let's say it happened. Where's our trust in God? So like, do we think that voter fraud snuck by God and God just like was surprised by it? If voter fraud did happen, is this part of God's plan? I mean, obviously I don't have the answer to this, but I'm curious what you guys think on this. And then like, if voter fraud did happen, what's our response to it?
It's, man, what a hot button subject, man. Okay, so one of the verses that you constantly hear thrown out on both sides is Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. And then what everybody doesn't read is verse 2. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. So honestly, like if you're in a sense rebelling as a culture, let's say it did happen. Let's say that voter fraud did happen. If society itself or those powers that be rebel against the authority that God put in place, to me, do you really want to mess with the wrath of God? Because it feels pretty clear.
Now, do you think there's a difference between rebellion and civil disobedience?
I think you'd have to define those two. That's a great question. I don't have an answer.
I think that's the weird place we want, because our governing authorities, unlike kings where it's passed down through a lineage or some crazy thing, We're a government for the people, by the people, right? It's supposed to be that we select and they're accountable to us. And so it's the Constitution that shifts the playing field in some weird ways here, where you go, if you're getting bad leaders, in theory, it's on you, at least in America.
Okay, hold on. So let's pull this back for a second. David was anointed king before he was king, and another king sat in the king's seat. Was that, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say is there a, like, I wonder if we put God's justice in a box and make it about our responsibility rather than, and I know this goes to like, why would you ever vote? But like, to quote VeggieTales, God is bigger than the boogeyman. You know, like, have we created monsters out of, and it, like, we put so much faith in this document that was signed by dudes who literally didn't write it for certain people. So justice for all doesn't freaking exist. So if you put it in that context, it's like, why do we still hold the same context for that document when literally a gigantic portion of the population couldn't freaking vote? So it's to me, I'm going, like, I can't look at that document and say that is, like you said it earlier, it is not a perfect document. It's not something that's like God ordained. God didn't write it himself. And so there's this worship that happens that's so terrifying to me as a Christian, where I go, who's your faith in? Because if this whole thing was taken and it was robbed and there was all of this fraud, I believe in the justice of God, and I believe that there will be atonement for sin. And that's just my opinion on this. So I'll let everyone else talk.
Yeah, I just, to kind of chime in with that, I want to say, I think I agree. I want to throw out I want to play devil's advocate for a second though. Because that seems like that is somewhat of a similar argument that people will use to try to discount the Bible, is that it's a fallible document. It wasn't actually written by God. So, and when you remove the Bible from us as Christians, you're stripping out any foundation or guide rails that we have. So while I agree with, yes, the Constitution, our original founding documents, did have a lot of there's a lot of discrimination, but it's also, I guess, maybe I might stir the pot here, I believe it's one of the most durable documents, and it's one of the most godly inspired governmental documents, in the fact that it did manage, despite it being written by quote unquote racists or to actually encompass rights for all people. I mean, even just the phrase "all men are created equal" was pretty profound, and you haven't seen a whole lot, at least in my limited knowledge, I'm not sure of a lot of other documents that are able to encompass human freedom so well. So the reason I say that is, when you remove the authority of such, let's say, the Constitution, which I'm not even necessarily disagreeing with that, it does open up the space to, okay, what are we going to put in place of that?
Yeah, no, it's a great challenge. And I think there's been, you know, I didn't, a few years ago, I didn't even know if the Lord was real. You know, I went through a season, genuinely, I went through a season of like just a self-doubt. And, you know, I think you go through those seasons in life and you go through those ebbs and flows. But I came to terms, and Mark and I were talking about this. I had an encounter with Jesus, and that's what changed my life. And so I am fed by the word. I am fed by its context, but I'm not making my wife cover her head, even though that's a law. And so I think that there's amendments that we've made to the context of the Bible in recognizing its context, and amendments have been made to the Constitution. So I'm not saying it's not I think it's a beautiful document, but that my challenge is, what's our faith? Is our faith in the document? Is it, you know, I think that Mark, I think you had said in the beginning that like, oh, no. It was you, Austin, that was saying like, it's not one man can't take this down. And I think that with this whole Biden thing, I think if we realize, like as a culture, we realize that something happened and there was voter fraud, I think there is the mob mentality in the opposite reaction where there's going to be a revolt. And I'm not saying it a violent revolt, Lord forbid a violent revolt, but a revolt as a society going, hey, we've looked at dictators in the past that have done this. We've looked at societies in the past, and I think it becomes a moral obligation, at least for me. It becomes a moral obligation to say, you know, I think women should have an opportunity to vote. You know what? I think that, you know, I was about to go real dark, real deep, but like there's amendments that happen. And I think that we would have to look at like what allowed this thing to happen and as a society adjust and fix. And that's coming back to the, what is our moral obligation and mob mentality, coming back to that. I do think if it was exposed and if this is truth and if it comes out, which I know people would say it has, if it comes out, that's where for me, I go, okay, I have to do something now because I believe that this infringes on the rights of a fair and equal election. And that to me is important as a believer, as a believer who has a moral standing for what I believe our nation stands for and stood for and the beauty of what it was built on. I do think I have a moral obligation to that. What does that look like? Don't know yet.
It's so tough because I would say like the Constitution, I mean, I know a lot about it because I watched Hamilton a couple times, so I know a lot more about how our nation got started, which Hamilton's amazing. It's very much something that we aspire to be like, and even when it was written, like they came from an environment where they're like, we don't want to be like this. This is what we want to be like, and so they put a whole bunch of stuff in place on what they wanted to be like. And it reminds me of, and I won't name the name, but David and I worked at a company and we put in these, after both of us started there was this whole mission statement and I forget what the other like values of the company, and there's like 10 points of it. And we would kind of recite those and we'd memorize them, we'd learn them as a company. And they were all amazing things that we hoped and aspired to be like, but it didn't actually translate to day to day. And it was super frustrating because there were multiple points, and unfortunately one of them had to get removed. So there used to be 10 points. And then there was an issue with an employee where they tested it and they said, wait. One of these points you say, I forget what it was, but I think it was God first, family second, work last. So that was in a work statement in a Christian company with the Christian people there, Christian leader, and that was in there. And we would say that. And then one employee challenged it and was like, wait. You're taking me away from my family. And granted, there was some shady stuff happening, but they challenged that point and was like, you aren't living up to your expectation. You aren't this thing that we're like, you know, live and breathe and we bleed this. This isn't actually reality. And what's super frustrating is like, let's say voter fraud did happen. Let's say in these states, especially Michigan and Wisconsin and all the weird stuff that's happening in Pennsylvania, let's say voter fraud is exposed. Like, it still comes down to the Supreme Court from my understanding. And if the Supreme Court's like, meh, we don't think it's real, like, then that's it. Like, we have to live with that. Like, we have to deal with that. And I remember when Trump got elected over Hillary, how much like protests and riots and all this stuff was happening. And I was in complete shock because I'm like, do you guys think this is going to change something? Like, what do you hope to accomplish from going down to downtown Portland and wherever else they were doing it and just lighting stuff on fire and screaming and yelling and saying recall Trump and all this stuff instantly? I'm like, what is this going to do? Like, do you think that they're going to sit somewhere and be like, hey, Portland, Oregon's acting up. Like, I think we should probably, let's change it. Like, Hillary should win. So I don't know. I could talk all night on this stuff for sure.
Yeah, you know, where it gets like early presidents and the founders they'll say it in different ways, but they'll kind of communicate this idea that any law, any document, the Bill of Rights are only as good as the hearts of the people that are under them. And that as soon as morality leaves, a Christ-centered morality leaves, they hold no weight. They're powerless to govern. It's basically a moral submission under these things that gives them their power. And so I guess the challenge is, let's say that there are roads that this election could turn that are outside of the Supreme Court, right? Like there are things that can happen. December 6th is going to be a big one, and there are theories of how that could go a different way with different slates of electors and other things. But let's say that Trump pulled that off. That's not going to right underlying things that are off in this country, and any more than Biden getting in is going to exacerbate those things. I think the true power of the church has always been in the gospel of Christ, right? And if a man's or a woman's heart is given over to Christ and they convert and they yield to Christ, and the Holy Spirit begins conforming them, the change that can happen in their life is so radical and so transformative that it turns families and communities and all of the rest. And so, on the one hand, I'm very passionate about seeing a just political system and a free and fair election, whatever that is or looks like. I find conviction in my own life that there are definitely days and weeks that I've spent more time, consuming politics and trying to figure out the nuance of this article or that. And that same time hasn't been spent in the Word of God or with the Lord in prayer and seeking how He would seek to use me to directly impact the world around me. And so I think that's a bit of the tension point. Like you can't give up. I don't think you can just bail on the world. I still don't know the degree to which a Christian should care about politics. I personally care about it a lot. I just don't know if I'm wrong or obsessed or I get too into it. But if a Christian were to say, I'm going to spend all of my effort on preaching the gospel and trying to live out the gospel in my immediate sphere of influence, and trying to do for others as I would have them do unto me, and represent Christ to the best of my ability to everyone I contact with, I'm just not going to vote. I'm not going to fault them for that. I probably think you're living a better life than I am. And so I don't know what to do about that. And yet I have this thing that's like, I want to march to the Capitol and,
That's convicting, bro. That's huge. That's huge. I mean, yeah. I even love the documents are only as good as the people under them. That's freaking, whoa, that's so much to unpack.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Oh, no, go ahead, Mark.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I love the emphasis on your first responsibility is as a believer, and that your first responsibility is to maintaining your connection with the Lord and the Word. And I think that it is convicting completely, because I know I really struggle with this. I get so caught up in wanting to establish justice and to change the world that I will neglect my personal own transformation. And one of the things that I've been kind of meditating on specifically with this topic is how much time is the time that I'm energy spending trying to right the world, so to speak. Am I actually neglecting my own responsibility and my own relationship to better myself? And I think one of the things that Jordan Peterson once said is that activism is in a lot of ways is a shortcut to moral virtue, because when you're actually trying to work on things that are like your own self, those are a lot harder and those are a lot more hidden, so you don't get recognition. And I see so many Christians who, not trying to judge their heart, but their actions seem to indicate they're trying to seek justice and to chase justice, but they're not actually doing it. They're not treating their neighbor and those on others on social media lovingly, which is the first responsibility as a believer, is just to love people, like as simple as that. But their drive for justice is overriding their personal responsibility to love.
Yeah. That is so real. I struggle with this, and I know we're a little over time, so I'll try to wrap this up. And if you guys have to leave, you have to leave. But what's challenging for me is my person lost the election, and it's a bummer. I do think that there's some shady stuff that happened because there's just some weird things, and you kind of look at like, well, this is the first time that I know of that election day spanned several days, and it wasn't just the votes that counted that day. But I understand we're in unprecedented times, all the stuff, COVID, there's so many different things. What's frustrating to me though, is I'll try to like use a weird analogy for a moment. I love sports. I'm a huge sports fan, completely huge sports fan. I love it, especially basketball. I was so bummed when the Warriors lost last year, and it was super unfair because Kevin Durant tore his ACL. Klay Thompson like injured his knee, and you just kind of go, okay, like we lost. Like congrats to the team that won. They did a wonderful job. And I know there's even stuff with like when the Heat beat the Dallas Mavericks in the NBA Finals, I forget how many years ago. Mark Cuban hired a private investigator who was a former FBI agent to like track down and like interview and investigate these referees because he's like, it was rigged. And like so what if that was true? Like the other team, they got outplayed. Like it at the end of the day, like it doesn't matter if 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 calls, like it doesn't usually go down to that. It's the best of 7, right? And so what's challenging though is my person so far has lost the election, but then I have tons of people that I love and respect who are like, hey, our daughter watched the vice president give a speech, and our daughter's in just awe and is just longing and just like full of hope and wonder of what could be for them. And then I have people that I know and I love and respect that are not Caucasian, that are not white, and they're like, finally somebody looks like us. Like it's not Obama, a black person, but she's Puerto Rican, she's Latino, whatever. Like they're like, she looks like us. And so I think in loving our neighbor, it's really hard for us to go like, your team cheated, our team won, when these people are like, no, like you don't understand. This is the first time in my life that I've had hope, that there is going to be hope for a change, because I literally do not even I can't even comprehend what it's like to grow up in as a different race, a different nationality in America. Like I grew up in a primarily white environment. I still live in a pretty white community, and so I know that there's so many struggles that they have. And so it just feels like, for me personally, when I read about Jesus saying like, love your neighbor, I feel like it's wrong and not loving to just kind of like be like, your team, like your team cheated, like your team's wrong, like your side's wrong, like no, this is the Antichrist, whatever. I mean, I've heard all of it, and I've heard like your people are going to bring in communism, there's Marxism, like I've heard all of it, and it just feels like, I don't know. It just feels like it's beyond us, and like, if voter fraud happened, it happened, and we still need to like love one another. But I'd be curious what you guys think as we kind of wrap this up, and just talking on the idea of like, what does it look like to love your neighbor through this when your neighbor has difference of opinion, when they're on the other side, and that could be they're on the Trump side or the Biden side, they're on the voter fraud happened or didn't happen.
Well, I guess what I like about this debate is the discussion. I've been in debates. This is pretty mild. So I'd fall back on the idea of speaking the truth in love. And so I will say this about Jesus, like If you watch him, he will, to your point, Austin, he will say things that directly oppose power and religious authority and governmental authority and all sorts of stuff. And the one thing he refused to do was to be silenced. So he wouldn't yield truth. He wouldn't back off of truth for the sake of making, a semblance of peace. So he would always say truth, and yet he was insanely gracious, right? I mean, I think one of my favorite things as I go through the Gospels is watching how often Jesus will ask people questions, and they tend to be people he shouldn't have been talking to, so Samaritan women or whatever else, and he'll allow them, in essence, the first word. Like, I'll hear you out, and then he'll respond. And there's enough of a weight to his response where it does some incredible things. And so I think more cancerous than the prospect of voter fraud, this cancel culture mentality, this thing that's kind of setting in where you don't have the freedom to speak an opinion that could be wrong or that isn't fully formed. You don't have any latitude or any grace in doing that. It stunts your maturity and it stunts your growth, because nobody is born fully formed, and all of us kind of grow through our mistakes into the people we're going to become. And if you had a record of any of us at 15, 16, the wisdom that we would espouse to the world, we'd go, you were a fool back then. And I'd say that about me at 20, and I'd say that about me at 30, and I'm sure the 50-year-old will say it about me now. But if I can't ever share an idea, there's no way for me to grow. Now, the counterpoint of that is you got to have some semblance of thick skin. You have to be centered enough as a person to hear a contending point of view that you may not agree with. And I think that is one of the incredible blessings of Christ and God's word, is that it centers you and it locks you down on a solid enough foundation where I would hope that any of us could hear any political idea, any religious idea, any philosophy from any person, and just hear it out and not be scared that if it comes from a communist or a socialist, that's enough to rock us off the foundation of Christ. And so there's a bit of it too, where when you talk about social media and certain people and fall on political attack mode, and you wonder, where's the grace in your speech? Where's the Christ in your message? And there's a lot of weird stuff going on in our culture right now that's feeding kind of the messed up stuff we're in with the politics. So I'll leave my closing thought at that.
And I love that, like, talking to somebody isn't going to knock you off your foundation. I think, I had a conversation with a friend that literally is like the exact opposite of what I grew up in, literally on every shape and form. And I found more Jesus in communicating with this person. And this person has no idea who Jesus is. I found more Jesus talking with them than I have probably in the last couple of years talking with Christians. And I think the one of the things Mark and I have been playing with is just this idea of, like, how do you have arguments in the, in a sense, the cancel culture? Like, how do you have disagreements and still come out and not even to, like, I'm coming to prove my point. I'm coming to, like, there's this, like, macho thing that happens with everybody. They're like, puff their chest and want to prove a point. And I think that, like, I'll probably look back at this whatever it's going to become, and post or podcast or whatever, and I'll look back on it in a few years and be like, whoa, like, what was that? And I think, but isn't that the progression? Like you're saying, like, it's this, like, iron sharpens iron, but that process looks crazy, I just sharpened my axe with iron, and you're taking off a layer and a layer and a layer every time you scratch that. And I think that when I hear that, I'm like, yeah, no, like brothers, like coming together, unity, like let's do this thing. And then you're like, wait, no, actually it's disagreement, and it's this allowing somebody to, in a sense, rub off that callus or get through that decisive tension. And I think that the beauty of this conversation is I'm walking away with a document of notes, so stoked on differing opinions and thought processes that like totally F with the way that I look at this thing. Like I had never put into mind, I'd gone mob mentality with this whole thing. This literally everything that's happening, going, I'm going to do my research and look at both sides, but I'm not going to actually do anything about it. And virtue signal and do all the things and talk passionately, but not actually follow that up. And David, I am so truly convicted in what you brought to the table, because now I have to go face, like, what am I going to do? Either way, it doesn't matter. What am I going to do? Because I don't want to be a banging cymbal, you know? It doesn't make sense to me to do that. So thank you for what each of you brought to the table. I feel very deeply convicted, and iron sharpens iron. I feel like I got a little bit rubbed off of me tonight.
Yeah, and then it's just, that's such a good question. You both have brought such amazing perspectives and opinions to this discussion. It's definitely going to give me a lot to chew on for the next few days. But as far as loving people, kind of my thought process with it is, when I look at Jesus, belief never was a requirement. No matter what, was never a requirement for relationship. And for me, you can have any sort of belief. You can be a fascist. You can be a communist. You can believe in the superiority of a race or the inferiority of a race. And no gross belief is going to preclude you from being in a relationship with me, because that's just, Jesus was around people who were had some pretty messed up beliefs and lifestyles on both ends of the aisle, of both hyper legalism and just complete debauchery. So. And I think you make such a good point, Josh, about how, and David, how there needs to be this evolution of ideas. You need to allow yourself to be able to draw a line in the sand saying, I'm not crossing this, but allow that line to move as you grow and mature. And I think we sometimes so easy, I shouldn't say I have struggled with, where I'll want to draw a line in the sand, but I won't allow other people to do that. Like, I'll want to say, these are my values, I'm sticking to my guns, but I'll judge other people and be critical of other people who do the same when they're different to mine. And I think one of the things that is so important, being able to love your neighbor, is having grace with your neighbor. I think those are the same exact thing. You need to be able to have grace and have allow people to change, or if they not change, and allow yourself to be changed. Because if you're lacking that, you're really, Jesus, being the perfect example, opened himself up to lots of ideas while still remaining true to his values. So, and I think that's how that practically plays out, is going to depend on relationship per relationship. But I think at a baseline, loving your neighbor is not allowing their beliefs about a topic to preclude or exempt them from being in a relationship with you.
Yeah, that's good. And as my closing thoughts, you guys have all said some really amazing things. And I think what I've been stewing on for the last few days is, like, can you actually influence without relationship? I don't know that you can. I don't know that it's fruitful. I haven't seen it in my life. I have a quick story about, like, there's a small local clothing boutique here in Reading that I'm wanting to do freelance marketing with. And my wife and I shopped there a ton and just loved it. And even before we lived here, we'd shop there. And so I reached out and talked to her and just said, like, hey, here's what I can offer you and all this stuff. What was pretty crazy about the conversation is she's like, you don't understand how many people have come to me and have told me how I'm doing everything wrong and how they can help me better my Instagram feed and I can make it more aesthetic and all this stuff. And she's like, but you're the only one who's actually come alongside and like been willing to help. And also like all these other people who are like pros who said, oh, I can help you do better. Or I can do this. I can change this. She's like, none of them have actually stepped foot in my store. And I recognize you and your wife. Like you guys have shopped in my store and I know that you actually care. And so that was pretty cool for me. And I was like, oh, okay, like that's cool. But then like that's been something I've continually like gone back to. And in all of this, whether it's politics, whether it's boycotting about mask policies, whether it's like whatever. I mean, I've seen so many boycotting in my life. Everybody's so quick to be like, no, 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 you're wrong. I'm right. And I'm going to tell you all the reasons why you're wrong. And there's no relationship there. But what's so crazy though is anytime you look at Jesus in the New Testament, like even with the woman at the well, like, could you imagine if he would have just gone to the woman and been like, hey, like you're sleeping around with more than one person? Like that conversation would have she would have been so closed off, but he like actually engaged with her and like talked to her and like saw past what she was. And then he was like, hey, by the way, like you're with more than one man, you know? And even the same thing with like the whole, the woman caught in adultery, like Jesus is just so relational and like we're supposed to be like him. And so, and all of this stuff, it feels ridiculous for us to sit in our own self-proclaimed ivory towers of where we're at and think we have all the answers and that social media is now our outlet and we should just throw stones at everybody else, when it's like, no, 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 like we need to have a level of relationship. And I do think very similar to like, let's say missionary. I would say politics and missionary, I would just put them two as the same for now. I don't think everybody's called to be a missionary. I don't think that. I do think there's a specific group of people that are called to be missionaries that are willing to like sell it all, live third world country, do all that stuff. And that's great that God's done that for them. That's not for me, but I can sow into what they're doing and I can like bless them. Now, some people, that may be the case in politics, like David's brought up, like some people may be loving people more and not be voting. But I do think that there's still an element of like being able to sow into everything. Like just because I'm not called to be a missionary doesn't mean that I'm not called to like support it or sow into it or like find those people who are like doing the Lord's work and spreading the gospel throughout the world. Like I should still be supporting them, even though it's not my call to do it. But I don't know. I could, again, boycotting all this topic, I could go all night. So any closing thoughts from any of you guys before we wrap this up?
Don't debate politics over social media. It is the biggest death trap. It's just, yeah. I think, for me, one of the coolest things that God did through all of this, it was when the Black Lives Matter marches were really kicking off. And so there's a lot in that from different sides. But my daughter and I have vastly different views of the world, politically, socially, and so it was a real it was a difficult spot. I didn't know exactly how to what to do with that. And so I remember the Lord, I believe, I think it was the Lord leading me to go, I want you to listen to voices you don't normally listen to. Just go listen to this podcast, listen to this YouTube video, things that would normally come up in my feed. And I'm like, I ain't touching that, right? Like I already know they're wrong. And so I would say maybe 80% of it, I didn't agree with, but there was definitely a solid 20 where I was like, okay, that is a compelling point. And then I felt like she lives in Portland. And I felt like the Lord was like, I want you to call her and just say you want to hear her perspective. And don't try to convince her of anything. Don't try to do whatever. And so I did. And she was like, oh yeah, I'd love to talk. And so I just let her talk for a while. And then she was like, well, what do you think? And she's not a believer. And what was so interesting to me about the whole conversation was it would come back to issues of justice and dignity. And so for me, my belief and my relationship with Christ goes, those concepts are firmly rooted in the fact that people are made in the image of God. So therefore they cannot be treated as less than that. It's contrary to the foundation of what I believe. And so in the course of this conversation, I shared the gospel, I think more than I ever have with her. And so it was dumbfounding in a way, where it was like, you went a direction that you would have thought was a dead end, that had no value. And in going down that, and I guess maybe in a humility or a willingness to kind of just be open to do things a different way, it puts you in greater reliance on me. And so if we were to look at like the life of Jesus, conventional wisdom meant nothing. He was always speaking against it. Whatever authority was there, whether it was Roman or Pharisee or Sadducee, or he was constantly speaking in ways that subverted that, whatever their wisdom or logic was. And so I guess for myself, I'm probably more saying this to myself, I have to listen to Christ more than any other, bit of wisdom, or it's like a fool's errand. I'm setting myself up to just be misled. So
good. Anyone else? I have stuff to say, but I want to give the floor to anybody else.
Yeah, I just so agree with David that I think one of the things that I've noticed in people that are really close, that I'm really close with in my life, who are authority figures for me, is that there's some who have created this echo chamber of ideas. And while I think there's wisdom in what you expose yourself to, I mean, if you look at Jesus, he was constantly being challenged and faced with ideas that were contrary to the ones he was presenting, and that actually not only did that not cause him to shake in his belief, but it enforced it, and it caused other people to see truth in what he was saying. And one of the things that I've really been striving to do recently is making sure that I'm connecting and exposing myself to people who see the world differently. And David, I think that's a beautiful way to put it. Not that they have a necessarily different belief, but they have a fundamental different way that they see the world that most likely represents something of Christ that I'm missing. And I think when we look at people of the opposite persuasion as actually representing if they're representing a godly, something that is godly at the baseline, like justice or truth, then we're able to actually say, I may disagree with your conclusion, but the foundation that you're coming from carries a lot of wisdom and weight, and there's something that I could learn from that. And I think you're only going to be able to get another side of Jesus if you're exposing yourself to people who you disagree with.
Yeah, that's so good. I'll close off by saying, like, I think there's two things I'll say. One, I think we will have to get together again because there's so much to talk about. I love talking with all you guys. What's special to me this year specifically, I just want to highlight on like the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't fully comprehend it. I don't know all of the nuances that it has and everything that it entails. All I know is that when it came time for there to be a march here or a rally here in Reading, I chose to go because I know people of the Black community that are friends, people that I look up to, people I respect to, and I just wanted to be on their side. I wanted to like go in support of them, especially when I heard about how one of the sweetest guys that I know had instances of racism here where he was wrongfully arrested and put in handcuffs just because of his skin color. And that shook me to my core, because I'm like, okay, this is more than just what I believe. This is what they're struggling with. And this is like, I'm going to go because this matters to them, not because it's like it didn't change anything. It didn't like change how the government structure happened in Redding, California. It didn't change any rules or policy. It's not like they've enforced a new thing because there are all these people gathered. But what was so special though is they decided that they were going to do a 1.5 mile march and keep it completely silent in solidarity for what was happening. And for a mile and a half, nobody said a word. As I'm not sure how many people were there, but probably hundreds to, if not close to 1,000 people marched in just complete silence for what was mattering. And I don't have all the answers, but it was one of the highlights of my year of just going and supporting and just being a part of something that just felt so special. And I don't know, I feel like, again, it comes back to the relationship element. Like, I don't think we can influence that relationship. And I've seen it so many times on a smaller scale where, whether it's a promotion at work, where once an opening happens, all these people jump for it. And they're like, hey, no, I want to be the manager. I want to be the boss. And everybody's like, wait, this is the first time I've heard you say this. And they're like, well, I want the more money, or I want this. And it's like, no, like, this has to be something that you're passionate about. This has to be something you care about. And like, again, it's the Lord who's going to like highlight you. But I'm ranting. So, well, gentlemen, I've kept you 30 minutes past your time. So I appreciate you guys all joining in on this and risking this endeavor, and me maybe getting potential sound bites from all of you. I hope this was as fruitful and exciting for you as it was for me, because I love just being able to see all your faces and talk to you guys.
This is great.
Yeah, for sure. Austin, Joshua, thank you. It was great getting to meet you, spend this time. And Mark, thanks for setting it up.
Yeah.
It's cool.